Hi everyone. Today I want to talk about gun control. When gun control comes up in American politics, it's usually centered on the right of civilians to own guns. This video is about a different kind of gun control. I'm talking about the kind that would curb police violence. If you're watching this video, then you're no doubt familiar with dozens of instances of civilians being killed by police. Maybe you're an ardent leftist like myself who already has strong opinions on what should be done about this. Or maybe you're someone in the center who views this as an unfortunate consequence of necessary police protocol with no easy solution. This video is aimed at people in the latter category. The truth is, there is a simple, reasonable solution to police shootings, and that would be to take guns away from the police. It may sound absurd, but by the end of this video, I hope you'll agree it's a much safer, more sensible, and moral way of policing than what we currently have in the United States. Before I go any further, I'd like to mention that this video will contain descriptions, but no images or videos of shootings. Here's how my vision of police disarmament looks. Instead of having every on-duty police officer constantly have a gun on them, they will be required to leave all guns in police stations. They'd pick up a gun only when they are in pursuit of someone who has recently shot another person. When I say shot another person, I mean the bullet has to have actually hit them rather than being fired in their direction. Once the chase for the shooter has ended, all armed police officers are required to return their guns to the police station. I'll get into the details of why I chose this kind of disarmament later in the video. Right now, I want to address another YouTuber by the name of Mike the Cop, because while I strongly disagree with him on this topic, he has two videos that do a good job of presenting common arguments against disarmament while dispelling common misconceptions about police shootings. The first is called Should We Disarm All the Cops? And the second is called UK versus US Policing, To Arm or Not to Arm. I recommend watching both of his videos in full to be sure I'm not misrepresenting him. You can pause this and come back if you like, or watch Mike's videos after mine. Whatever order you watch in, I think it's good to hear his full argument. If you feel like I'm not fair to him at any point, then please leave a comment.
Oh, sounds great, doesn't it? If we take away the guns from the police, then no one can die from getting shot by the police. Simple. Sounds glorious. We'll all go sit on the corner of a cliff and watch the sunset together. If we don't want any more products to get shoplifted, stolen, we just don't have stores, because we wouldn't have to worry about that.
Shoplifting is a crime born of poverty. Police officers are agents of the state with a wide set of responsibilities that put them in a position where they are more likely to kill people. There is no equivalent group of workers in retail whose job occasionally asks them to kill. The closest job I can think of is security guards, and it's quite common for them to be prohibited from physically harming anyone on the job. They're mainly supposed to stand around and look tough. If they actually intervene when someone is shoplifting, they risk getting fired. Look at what happened to this Target security guard. The manager told him he should have approached the girl and asked if he could help her find something. Babcock said, "Only certain supervisors can stop suspected shoplifters, a step that security guards aren't empowered to take." Or this Best Buy security guard. Best Buy said the employee's actions violated company policy, which forbids workers from intervening with illegal events outside the store. Our policy is clear. Employees are not to chase potential criminals outside of the store, the company told ABC affiliate KXTV in a statement. Chasing an individual in the parking lot creates a safety risk that isn't worth taking, regardless of how noble an employee's intention is.
And you know how many people would die in car accidents if we just got rid of cars? Zero.
Although it's possible to kill people with a car, killing people isn't what they're designed for. If your goal is to kill someone, then there are much more effective ways to do so, like a gun, for instance. Also, it's worth pointing out that we actually do get rid of cars sometimes when they're proven to be unsafe. It's quite common for the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration to issue car recalls. Since 1966, more than 390 million vehicles have been recalled in the United States. Here's one recent example. On September 26, 2018, there was a recall on the 2019 Volkswagen Jetta. The reason? The passenger side headlight may be incorrectly positioned, reducing the driver's visibility when it is dark. As such, these vehicles fail to comply with the requirements of the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard, FMVSS, number 108. lamps, reflective devices, and associated equipment. Seems pretty dangerous, huh? Like something that would cause some unnecessary harm or death? In order to prevent people from being harmed, car owners should get their headlights fixed. The NHTSA doesn't just throw up their hands and say, oh well, if some drivers can't see at night, then that's just how it is. No need to do anything about this. Instead, the car manufacturer is required to let owners know about the recall and fix the headlights. Now I know how some people are going to respond to this. Recalls don't completely get rid of cars. It only takes the defective ones off the roads. You'd be totally right to point this out. We still do something about unsafe cars though. We don't accept that this is just the way things are. We make changes. The other reason I don't think Mike's comparison applies to cars very well is if you compare the impact on the country of getting rid of cars to the impact of disarming police. If all cars disappeared tomorrow and there were no improvement to other forms of transportation such as trains, bike lanes, or making rural areas more walkable, then getting around would immediately become much more difficult. This would have severe negative impacts on public life. The same isn't true for police disarmament. In fact, Mike actually proved this himself without realizing it. Let's jump ahead in this video for a bit.
First is that the vast majority of engagements with the police are completely and utterly unremarkable. In other words, you have a 99.9999, maybe I might have missed a 9, 2% chance to be absolutely fine when you encounter the police. That's only the percentage of being fine when you encounter the police. It's way higher when you talk about the chances of both encountering the police in your day and having a fatal encounter with the police. My first contention is this is a non-issue. We don't need to disarm the police because the police having weapons and using them is a statistical non-event. Now let me be very, very clear. That does not mean that I'm advocating that we go around shooting people.
What are we to conclude from that? Well, it means being a police officer isn't nearly as dangerous as many believe. It's not unheard of for police officers to go their entire career without ever shooting anyone. Why then does the idea of taking guns away from them scare people? Mike said himself that in more than 99% of encounters, police don't use their guns. You could lower that percentage by having them shoot everyone on sight, but neither Mike nor I are advocating for that. Since Mike brought up some statistics, I'd like to counter with some stats of my own. In August 2014, Mike Brown was shot to death by police in Ferguson, Missouri, despite being unarmed. The following protests reignited long-existing national debates on police violence. In 2015, both the Washington Post and the Guardian began keeping their own databases on police shootings. Unfortunately, the Guardian seems to have stopped keeping track after 2016, but the Washington Post is still trucking along. In June of 2019, I decided to look through their data for all of 2018. Here's what I found. 992 people were killed by police in the United States in 2018. What happens when we apply my criteria for when police are allowed to have guns? Remember, I say police should only arrive on the scene with a firearm when it makes sense to do so. That is, when they are going after a person who has recently shot someone else. The Washington Post allows you to sort out the people who didn't have guns on them. Right off the bat, you learn that 441 of 992 people didn't have one. Police in other countries are able to stop violent criminals who are either unarmed or armed with weapons that aren't guns, so there's no reason to believe police here can't do it. The Washington Post data doesn't get specific enough for me though. Just because someone had a gun on them doesn't mean they shot someone with it. For that information, I decided to look through the remaining 551 shootings in the 2018 database and keep track on my own. But that's what I planned anyway. After the first 34, I realized that at the pace I was moving through these stories, I would have to devote months just to categorize all these deaths. I have a day job, you know. I don't make money off YouTube like some of the more popular channels on here, so I went with a different strategy. For the remaining 517 deaths, I crowdsourced my data with the help of Amazon MTurk. I turned the Washington Post data into a spreadsheet that I sent off to Amazon and paid an army of strangers to read details about each death and answer a few questions about them for me. The following results are linked in the video's description. I'll go over a few findings now though. Please take these numbers with a grain of salt. By the time I get through them, you'll see that even these admittedly rough numbers don't look great for people who oppose police disarmament. Each of the 517 deaths were examined by 5 of my MTurk collaborators. They read articles about the deceased person and were asked to answer 5 yes or no questions. The questions were: 1. Did this person fire one or more shots without hitting anyone before police arrived? 2. Did this person fire one or more shots that hit anyone after police arrived? 3. Did this person fire one or more shots without hitting anyone after police arrived? 4. Did this person fire one or more shots that hit anyone after police arrived? And 5. Did this person express suicidal thoughts at any time before or after police arrived? I also have a 6th column in my spreadsheet for whether or not the person showed any signs of mental illness, but that data came directly from the Washington Post. In 220 of the 517 cases, the MTurk respondents had unanimous answers for all 5 questions. I was super confident about those results. What about cases where the respondents weren't unanimous? For each question, I took the answer that appeared the most times as fact. I'm certain there were at least a few mistakes, but if you're skeptical about my findings, I remind you that all the data I collected is linked below, and you're welcome to read all the articles linked and come to your own conclusion. Now for the final tallies. Question 1. Did this person fire one or more shots without hitting anyone before police arrived? 41 out of the 992, or less than 5% of people killed by police in 2018, had even fired a gun just before police arrived. Question 2. Did this person fire one or more shots that hit anyone before police arrived? 40 out of 992 people had actually shot another person when the police had arrived. Something interesting happens at question 3. Did this person fire one or more shots without hitting anyone after police arrived? 159 out of 992 people fired their gun after police arrived. I think it's reasonable to conclude that the presence of armed police officers is what caused the person to shoot. This number is more than 3 times the answer to question 1. When people know that police are coming after them with lethal force, they're much more likely to use lethal force of their own. It's also worth pointing out that even though it's really difficult to stop a shooter without killing them, it isn't impossible. I'll get into more details about this later. Question 4. Did this person fire one or more shots that hit anyone after police arrived? 71 out of 992 people managed to actually hit someone with their gun after police arrived. Question 5. Did this person express suicidal thoughts at any time before or after police arrived? This one had the most surprising result to me. 49 out of the 992 people armed with guns who were killed by police were suicidal. That's more than the number of people who had fired a shot before police arrived. The last category is one I was able to take straight from the Washington Post. Did this person show any signs of mental illness? 109 of the 551 people who had guns on them showed signs of mental illness. That's 19.8%. I used 551 as my denominator instead of 992 in this case because there were other people killed by police who showed signs of mental illness but didn't have a gun on them. Remember, the full dataset is linked in the description. As I was working on this, I cleaned up some minor error in the Washington Post database. For example, on May 11, 2018, a man named Kelly G. Abbott was killed by police in Clark County, Wisconsin. He is reported as having been in possession of a gun and was fleeing police by car when they shot him. On the same day, there's an unidentified man killed by police in York, Wisconsin. He also had a gun and was fleeing police by car. Now, there's a place called York in Jackson County, Wisconsin, but if you click Washington Post's link, you'll see that the York being referred to is the one in Washington County. I figured it was safe to assume that these two entries in the database were about the same person. More than 30 of the 551 people with guns in the database were unidentified at the time they were added. While researching, I managed to identify a person who was killed on June 13, 2018 in Denver, Colorado. His name was Carnell Nelson. I took the liberty of filling in his name in my version of the data. Another correction I'd like to spend some time on is the entry for Armand Beckwith Bell. If you filter the Washington Post's 2018 database down to people with guns, he won't be listed, and I can kind of see why they'd make that decision. Police weren't searching for an armed man when they killed him. Here's what happened. Police received a call about what is only described as a disturbance in St. Louis, Missouri. When the 2 officers arrived on the scene, they saw Armand sitting in his car. He wasn't threatening anyone, he was just sitting there. They tried speaking to him, but he didn't respond. In America, civilians have no obligation to speak to law enforcement. Armand Beckwith Bell was exercising his right to remain silent. Police say they saw a gun in his car, then tried to open the door and take it away from him. One of the officers fought Beckwith Bell for the weapon as Beckwith Bell drove off. The officer then shot Armand Beckwith Bell. I'd like to point out that Missouri has some pretty lax gun laws. Police say they saw a handgun in Armand's car. Let's take a look at the National Rifle Association, or the NRA's, summary of Missouri's handgun laws. You do not need a permit to purchase one. You do not need to register your handgun. You do not need a license to own one, and you do not need a permit to carry one. The police officers also did not have a warrant to search the car. They broke the law to kill a man who was minding his own business. There was no body cam of the killing either, so all we have is the officer's word, which already incriminates them. They could have even planted the gun, and we would have absolutely no way of knowing. The reporting on the story is interesting too. I could only find 2 stories about this case. One written by a local CBS affiliate KMOV4 and another by the local Fox affiliate Fox 2 Now St. Louis. Both make sure to mention that the car Beckwith Bell was in had been reported stolen, despite the fact that the police were not looking for a stolen car. They were responding to something described ambiguously as a quote-unquote disturbance. They had no way of knowing that the car was stolen when they arrived. This detail is included in the story so that you, the reader, will conclude that the man they killed does not deserve your empathy. They're hoping you'll think, oh, the car was stolen. This guy Armand had it coming. We don't even know if Armand Beckwith Bell is the person who stole the car. These kinds of details are littered throughout the articles on these police killings. Criminal records are provided despite the fact that police weren't aware of them at the time of the shooting. The same news outlets declined to remind readers of the deceased person's rights even when they were complying with the state's gun laws. Alright, now back to the earlier part of Mike's video.
But what if guns aren't the issue? What if it's people? And that's what we have to concern ourselves with, and not just the tools that police officers use.
Well, Mike is partially right here. He creates a false dichotomy by asking us to choose between people and guns. It isn't just about the guns. The officers who use them incorrectly should be taken into consideration as well. But the guns are still a major part of the issue. When cops kill unarmed people and later state that they did so because they feared for their lives, sometimes they're actually telling the truth. What we have here is a systemic problem, and systemic problems require systemic solutions. As an example, let's take a look at the March 2018 shooting of Stephon Clark. His death was well publicized, but just to give you a reminder, 2 police officers fired a combined total of 20 shots, with 7 of them hitting Clark, according to Sacramento County's autopsy. Police claimed to have shot him because they thought the cell phone he was holding was a gun. For this video, I'll take the officers at their word. They honestly thought their lives were in danger and did the logical thing, which would be to shoot Clark before he had a chance to shoot them. His death was just an honest mistake. This is a perfect example of why police disarmament is necessary. Do you remember why police were even in the area to begin with? They were looking for someone who was accused of breaking car windows. Is a person smashing car windows someone who needs to be met with lethal force? After all, it's just property damage. If someone smashed my car windows, I'd certainly be upset, but I wouldn't call for their death. Killing them would just be absurd. I think even the police who killed him would agree here. They didn't intend on killing anyone when they set out to find the window smasher, yet they ended up shooting an innocent person anyway. If we had a system like the one I proposed, where police only arrive with guns when there's an active shooter, then Stephon Clark and thousands of others would still be alive.
This all stems from this week mayoral candidate in Minneapolis. I'm not sure if I'm saying his name correctly, but Raymond Dine. He's from the Democratic Farmer Labor Party. Is that popular? He's calling for an overhaul of police policies, basically, that would disarm the police. That's how it's being touted, at least in the media. I couldn't find a direct quote where he said disarm the police in their entirety. My understanding is that what he wants to do is remove the sidearm from the police officers and essentially let them have weapons in their cars so that they could retreat to the car when they're in these stressful situations or under duress, they're under threat. Obviously, that's super practical.
My version of police disarmament is intentionally more extreme than this. I don't want police officers to have guns in their cars because it's effectively no different than our current system. The police officer who killed Tamir Rice would still have shot him if cops were expected to leave their guns in their cars. Only the officer or officers in the car have discretion over whether or not the gun gets used. I want them to leave the guns in the station. Leaving the guns at the station requires others who aren't at the scene to have to agree that the weapons are necessary. According to the cop's own numbers, Police would still be very safe under these circumstances. If you're a police officer watching this and you're uncomfortable with the idea of going to work without a gun on you, that's totally fine. I wouldn't want to be in your shoes, and that's part of why I'll never choose to be a police officer. You're free to quit the force at any time, and there's absolutely no shame in doing so.
What does he actually envision happening if police officers had no weapon when faced with the threat of a weapon? Would it look something like this?
Drop the knife! You asked for it! Sorry. I'm not coming out till I get what I want.
Please, let us go.
Help us. Shut up!
Sending somebody in with exactly what you asked for, okay?
You got a friend in me. You got a friend in me.
I'm out!
Hold on, we got some in the bag. Show yourselves, pigs.
Cover me.
Gotcha.
It's not working!
I only got this left.
All right, let's get serious here for a second.
I'll give real-world examples for all three of these.
Drop the knife! You asked for it!
You know who actually approaches police officers with a knife? People with mental illnesses. One such example is the 1984 shooting of Eleanor Bumpers. She was an elderly woman who lived in public housing in the Bronx. She had stopped paying rent, and a psychiatrist had determined she needed professional assistance due to the state of her mental health. When maintenance workers inspected her apartment in the weeks leading up to the shooting, they discovered cans of her own feces in her bathtub. The city ordered an eviction, but Bumpers refused to leave her home. On October 29, 1984, the NYPD attempted to forcibly remove her from the apartment. Bumpers was completely naked and armed with only a knife. NYPD officer Stephen Sullivan fired 2 shots at Bumpers, killing her. She didn't need to die, and if police operated under the rules I've given in this video, she wouldn't have. To the NYPD's credit, they did send an emergency service unit before the shooting. They were unsuccessful at getting her out of the apartment. What harm would have taken place if the police had just let her be? It was the city that determined she didn't deserve her home anymore. Bumpers was content to stay in her public housing unit for the rest of her days. The city intervened when they really didn't need to. The poor woman was probably terrified as officers attempted to force her out. Over 30 years later, a very similar shooting took place in the Bronx on October 18, 2016. This victim was named Deborah Danner. She was another woman with a mental illness who was shot to death in her home despite being armed with only a pair of scissors and a baseball bat. This is unacceptable. Training police officers to behave differently in these situations doesn't work. When officers feel scared, they'll use the most effective weapon on them. If that weapon happens to be a gun, then they'll end up killing someone who wasn't posing a lethal threat to anyone. If Stephen Sullivan didn't have a gun on him, Eleanor Bumpers would have survived their encounter. Deborah Danner would also still be here if the NYPD followed my policy. On to the next one.
I'm not coming out till I get what I want.
Please, let us go.
Help us. Shut up!
Sending somebody in with exactly what you asked for, okay?
You got a friend in me. You got a friend in me.
In a scenario like this one, if police followed my guidelines, then they would have to arrive unarmed if the person with the gun hasn't shot any of their hostages. Police would have to free the victims by either verbally convincing the perpetrator to release them or by subduing the perpetrator through non-lethal means. If at any point in the process the captor shoots one of their victims, then the police on the scene are free to call for armed backup. A real-world example I'd like to bring up here doesn't exactly involve a hostage, but I want to bring it up because it was very controversial even among people who are vocally opposed to police violence. I'm talking about Corinne Gaines. On October 1st, 2016, Corinne Gaines was killed by police in her home after a 6-hour standoff. Her 5-year-old son who was in the room watched his mother die and survived a wound from one of the officer's bullets. Gaines' death was especially notable due to the fact that she posted videos of the encounter on Facebook and Instagram. Gaines allegedly asked the officers to leave her home and threatened to shoot them if they didn't. Eventually, a cop fired at Gaines, she returned fire, and the cops fired again, this time killing her. Like I did with Stephon Clark's killing before, I like to talk about why police were there to begin with. The police arrived that day to arrest Corinne Gaines. Why was there a warrant for her arrest? What threat exactly did she pose to society that required her to be locked away? She didn't attend her court date following a traffic stop for driving without a license plate. That's it. Apply my disarmament rules to this situation and we have another life that could have been spared. Corinne Gaines never shot anyone. Like many of the other people killed by police who happened to be armed with a gun, I think it's reasonable to believe Gaines may not have loaded her shotgun if she lived in a country where police weren't always armed. Even if she did decide to grab her gun and threaten to shoot the officers, he could have simply complied to her request and left her alone. You might be tempted to respond, the police were following orders to arrest her. They couldn't have just walked away after she asked them to. They had a legal obligation. She was driving without a license and didn't go to court when she was supposed to. The law says she should be arrested. And what about her son? Surely he was in danger, right? Here's how I'd respond to the first part. Laws can be changed. That's kind of the whole point of this video. She didn't harm anyone while she was driving. If the state really wanted her to have a license plate, they could have just not taken it from her to begin with. In the video she recorded of the traffic stop, she claims the Eastern Correctional Institution took her plates from her car.
Okay.
I've identified myself.
Now, this is who I am.
Okay.
You
Who are you?
can read that. The owner of this vehicle.
You are Miss Gaines. Okay. Do
The
you
owner of
have
this.
a Maryland? Or is this vehicle registered in Maryland? Do you
Yes,
have a license
listen,
plate?
it was.
Was okay.
Okay?
Yes.
Now, I'm in the middle of suing you guys
Okay.
in ECI, and they came and took my tags off of my car. My car was properly insured.
Who's ECI?
That's a Eastern Correctional Institution.
Eastern
Okay?
Correctional?
I'm in the middle of actually.
So according to Gaines, the state takes away her license plate and stops her while driving for not having it. The state later demands that she go to court, she skips her scheduled court appearance, and the police show up to her apartment to arrest her. There's no need for police to be armed at this point because once again, Gaines hasn't shot anyone. She isn't even alleged to have caused any physical harm to anyone, yet cops arrived with guns because that's the protocol. The protocol needs to change. Police are also perfectly fine with ignoring the law when it allows them to get away with murder. Remember how Armin Beckwith Bell died? Police reached into his car despite having no legal right to do so and shot him to death. Police do on some occasions make unlawful arrests and plant evidence to help their case. When breaking the law harms a civilian, police have myriad justifications for doing so, and it's very common for quote-unquote good cops to go out of their way to cover up the illicit activities of their colleagues. Under my rule, the cops wouldn't even really have to lie. If unarmed cops following my rules arrived at Gaines' apartment but left without arresting her, all they have to say is, she had a shotgun on her and threatened to kill us if we didn't leave, so we decided to go. No one would hold that against those cops. That's a totally reasonable response. They'd be free to return at another time. They'd be able to make the arrest sometime when she's outside of her home without her shotgun. They'd still be free to call for backup, but importantly, the backup still wouldn't be allowed to have any guns on them because Gaines never shot anyone. Then there's a second objection. What about her son? Well, she never threatened to harm the boy. He hadn't been abused or neglected. The most damaging thing that happened to him was the gunshot wound and the trauma of having witnessed his mother's death. And both of those things were caused by police. Gaines' Instagram account is still up, and she has plenty of photos of herself and her family. Her kids appeared happy. Of course, a person's social media only reveals the parts of them that they want us to see. But none of the information released to the public gives any indication that she ever intended to harm any of her children. A local Baltimore news station interviewed the boy's father, and I was disappointed but not surprised at how it was received. The video currently has more dislikes than likes. Here's what the top comment says. She put her kid in that situation. Seemed like people want to make money off being bad parents. This is just plain old victim blaming. You often see a similar reaction when a celebrity's nude photos get leaked. People say, if you didn't want us to see the picture, then you shouldn't have taken them. My reply to those people is almost the same as the one I give regarding Gaines. Just as the person who leaks someone else's photos is ultimately at fault, so are the officers who shot Gaines also at fault. People talk about police as though they aren't human beings with a conscience and a capacity for empathy like the rest of us. They may have honestly feared for their lives that day, but instead of walking away when they were asked to, they decided to force their way in and kill Gaines. They chose to end her life when they didn't have to. Could Gaines have acted differently in a way that would have kept officers out of her home to begin with? That's not as simple of a question as it might seem. Corinne Gaines grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, where the Washington Post reports she spent years in homes with lead paint. She was poisoned at a young age. A doctor determined she had signs of neurocognitive impairment. She tested high in lead levels from April 1993 to November 1994. Here's another quote from the Washington Post article. Terrence McCoy, in investigating the effect of lead poisoning on Baltimore after Freddie Gray, spoke to Ruth Ann Norton, the executive director of Green and Healthy Homes Initiative, formerly the Coalition to End Childhood Lead Poisoning. He wrote, "A child who was poisoned with lead is 7 times more likely to drop out of school and 6 times more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system," Norton said. She called lead poisoning Baltimore's toxic legacy, a still unfolding tragedy with which she says the city has yet to come to terms. Those kids who were poisoned decades ago are now adults, and the trauma associated with lead poisoning creates too much of a burden on the community, she said. So I ask again, could Corinne Gaines have acted differently in a way that would have kept her alive? The best I can say given all this information is maybe? Even if the answer were a definitive yes, the police still have a bigger obligation to not kill people who haven't attempted to kill anyone else. Now let's look at Mike's third scenario.
I'm out!
Hold on, we got some in the bag. Show yourselves, pigs.
Cover me.
Got you.
Here we have an active shooter. The police are already on the scene, which means someone must have called them or they just happen to be in the area already. According to my disarmament rules, they're not allowed to have guns on them because the shooter hasn't actually hit anyone. Why don't I want police to have guns in a situation like this? I want to talk to you about a kid named Lorenzo Clerkley Jr. He's a teenager in Oklahoma who was shot twice by police on March 10, 2019. Luckily, he survived. Clerkley and his friends were firing BB guns when someone who couldn't tell the guns were fake decided to call the cops on them. When Officer Kyle Holcomb arrived on the scene, he heard several shots go off. He demanded Clerkley drop the BB gun, then immediately shot him. Holcomb was not charged for the shooting. His lawyer Kurt Dewberry had this to say. The police department and the district attorney conducted their use of force investigation and cleared Holcomb for duty based on his cam footage, another officer's body cam footage, as well as report from the neighbor. John George, president of the Oklahoma Police Union, said the following. "I don't think the officer had any more time. It's just very unfortunate in this situation. He was a juvenile, and this wasn't a real firearm, but the officer doesn't know that at the time." Former police chief Bill City said this. "The bottom line is, if the officer feels like his life is threatened or someone else's life is threatened, then that deadly force is a last resort and we ask him to use it." According to how police are asked to operate, Holcomb didn't do anything wrong. A good case can be made that he legitimately feared for his life, and most people in his situation would have done the same thing. That's exactly the problem though. A harmless child could have died because of an unnecessary situation that police officers are placed in. If Oklahoma police instead operated under my disarmament rules, then Clerkley would have never been in danger. Officer Holcomb would have been forced to actually speak with him before any officer gets their hands on a gun. What about cases where the shooter actually does have a real gun though? What if their first couple of bullets missed, but the first cop arrives unarmed? Then, while the cop is there, the shooter really does shoot someone. What is the first unarmed cop to do? Well, the rules I've given allow that cop to call for armed backup because people's lives are really in danger. While they're waiting for backup, they don't have to just sit around and wait for the shooter to go on a rampage. Like I said earlier, it is possible to stop a shooter when you're unarmed. It's just really hard. Look no further than the heroic actions of James Shaw Jr. On April 22, 2018, he was a patron at a Waffle House in Nashville, Tennessee. A shooter killed 4 people and injured several others. While the shooter was reloading, Shaw was able to knock the gun out of the shooter's hands, forcing the gunman to leave and potentially saving lives. James Shaw isn't even a trained police officer. The guy's an electrical technician. Like hundreds of police officers who killed unarmed people, he too feared for his life at the same time, but because he didn't have a gun on him, he was forced to intervene through non-lethal means. If Shaw hadn't been there, and an unarmed cop was there instead, under my rule, the cop would have been free to stop the shooter the same way Shaw did, call for armed backup, or do both. The Waffle House shooter was captured alive the next day despite killing 4 people. Remember, this happened the same year police killed 952 people by my count who hadn't shot anyone. 441 of those 952 people didn't even have a gun on them. If you haven't gotten my point yet, let me make it clear. Another world is possible. Police didn't have to kill these people. In most of these cases, the department investigations did not find the officers guilty of any wrongdoing. killing is just part of the protocol. Officers are not expected to prioritize our lives over their own. Since that's how they operate, it's crucial that we make it impossible to kill people who aren't putting others in any lethal danger. What better way to do that than to disarm police? The theme of Mike's video can be summed up pretty well in the following quote.
That we live in a world where that has to happen sometimes.
This is only true if you have a very limited imagination. Police shootings of people who haven't caused life-threatening harm to others don't have to happen at all. Society is a constantly changing thing, and it can get a whole lot better if we decide to make the necessary structural changes.
And I know there's going to be people in the comments, well, that's the problem, the officers aren't being convicted. Listen, they go to the same court of law that you do. They are held to the same standard, if not a higher level of scrutiny in those cases where deadly force is used than anybody else. And so we're not going to pretend that cops just are given carte blanche by prosecutors around the country to just go do whatever they want. The facts just don't sustain that.
Part of this I agree with, and part of this I disagree with. I agree that the lack of convictions isn't the problem. The problem is that cops have guns on them. Most of the cops who kill people are cleared of wrongdoing before a trial takes place. Even if every cop who killed someone went to trial and was convicted, that wouldn't bring the people they killed back to life. Imprisoning people won't stop the shootings from happening. Our criminal punishment system is anything but just, and we should not rely on it as a solution for social problems. That's simply not what it's designed for. I disagree with Mike's statement that the cops are held to the same or higher standard of scrutiny as anybody else. Just think back to what happened to Eleanor Bumpers and Deborah Danner. Police entered the homes of people with mental illnesses and shot them to death. Both of their killers went to trial and both were acquitted. What's the likelihood of a civilian getting away with that? Cops have the massive benefit of working within the same system that's supposed to be determining their guilt. The system looks out for its own. Read this Vox article to see what I mean. It's called Cops Are Almost Never Prosecuted and Convicted for Use of Force. Sometimes the investigations fall onto the same police department the officer is from, which creates major conflicts of interest. If police are charged, they are rarely convicted. The National Police Misconduct Reporting Project analyzed 3,238 criminal cases against police officers from April 2009 through December 2010. They found that only 33% were convicted, and 36% of officers who were convicted ended up serving prison sentences. Both of those are about half the rate at which members of the public are convicted or incarcerated. Would more people die in mass shootings if police weren't always armed? It's very possible. But the total number of lives saved by disarmament would greatly exceed the number of dead hostages or mass shooting victims in a given year. According to Mass Shooting Tracker, there were 528 people killed in mass shootings in 2018. I counted only 40 people out of 992 who were killed by police that year who had shot another person before police got to them. That's 952 lives that could have been saved. It also means that in 2018, police collectively killed 424 more people who hadn't shot anyone than all mass shooters combined. Next, I want to talk about Mike's other video, UK versus US policing, to arm or not to arm. I'll be much more brief since many of the arguments are the same. In this video, he speaks to a UK police officer named James. Police in the UK already use guns in a way similar to what I've described. James wishes cops over there were armed like ours are. By now, of course, you know why I think he's wrong. I still want to go over a couple of specific things James brings up. He seems pretty certain that cops don't ever use their guns irresponsibly.
Some people seem to think we're going to have police officers here like spinning the gun round in the canteen like a cowboy and trying to quick draw and stuff.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen.
What you can observe in the United States is that this is rare, but does happen from time to time. On August 9, 2017, a retired librarian, Mary Knowlton, was accidentally shot to death by police during a demonstration. On May 15, 2019, an off-duty police officer accidentally fired his gun while reaching into his pocket at a Publix. The bullet hit another customer who thankfully survived. Stories like this are rare, but they do happen. You know where they don't happen at all? The UK. Why introduce the possibility of these rare shootings, plus hundreds of other non-accidental killings of non-life-threatening people? It just doesn't make any sense. The US should be following the UK on this issue, not the other way around. James also talks about the shooting deaths of UK police officers Nicola Hughes and Fiona Bone.
And this one person in particular was fingered for throwing a grenade at a opposition member and killing him. So he knew he was going to go to prison for a very, very long time. So he decided the best thing to do is he phoned in a fake burglary in progress report, the two officers turned up and he came out with a Glock 9mm with an extended magazine and shot them both. Now, they both actually lived long enough that if they'd had a firearm, they would, at least one of them would have survived.
What happened to these two women was tragic, and I don't make light of their deaths. What I do want to remind people of is that dying is one of the risks of being a police officer. It's sort of like how suffering burn injuries comes with being a firefighter. If you don't want to accept the risk of running into a burning building, then you just don't become a firefighter. It's totally okay to not be willing to take that risk because there are other jobs. If potentially being killed because you attempted to stop a violent criminal while you yourself is unarmed, then being a cop isn't the job for you. It's perfectly fine to not be a cop. I would never shame anyone for weighing the risk and deciding they don't want to take it. Some might say being a police officer without a gun is like being a firefighter without water. The reason I don't think this is a good comparison is because guns are designed to kill people and water isn't. If a firefighter accidentally sprays a fire hose at someone, then the odds of them injuring or killing that person are much lower than if that person had been shot by a police officer. My guidelines for police disarmament are intended to be the beginning of how we fundamentally change the nature of policing to make society safer. In my ideal world, which we are totally capable of creating if we try hard enough, police will be completely unrecognizable to how they are now. For instance, police disarmament alone won't end unnecessary police violence. Sandra Bland and Eric Garner both died without having been shot. As I alluded to when detailing the deaths of Corinne Gaines, Eleanor Bumpers, and Deborah Danner, police are a threat to people with mental illnesses. I recommend everyone watch a video by one of my favorite YouTubers, ThoughtSlime. He has a video called All Cops Are Bad that does a good job explaining why reform alone won't help. Any changes made to policing needs to be done with the ultimate goal of complete abolition of the prison industrial complex. Police's primary role in society is to help rich people hoard their wealth from the poor. It's why the bad things corporations do tend to be perfectly legal or result in a slap on the wrist, while the actions of poor people are more likely to be criminalized and severely punished. The title All Cops Are Bad is intentionally provocative, but I hope you don't let that scare you off. If you made it this far in my video, then know you have an open mind and will at least entertain some of ThoughtSlime's arguments. It would also be irresponsible for me to end this video without discussing race at all. You may have noticed that most of the examples I've discussed involve the deaths of black people. That's because black people are statistically more likely to be killed by police. If you look at the raw numbers, more white people are killed by police in a given year, but the proportion of white people killed by police is less than their share of the total population. Here's what I mean. 452, that's 45.5% of the 992 people killed by police in 2018 were white, but white Americans are over 73% of the population. 229, that's 23% of the 992 people killed by police in 2018 were black, while black Americans are only about 13% of the population. It should be obvious to most people that the United States is a racist country with racist institutions. Institutional racism means that even if 0% of the police officers are racist individuals, they are still working in a system that will put them in positions to harm black people at a disproportionately high rate. It's why some of the cops who commit violence against black people are themselves black. How are institutions racist? Unfortunately, that's out of the scope of this already very long video. Instead, I'll ask you to Google things like Jim Crow, redlining, mass incarceration, and the war on drugs. Please read one of my all-time favorite books called Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis. For something more recent, pick up a copy of Carceral Capitalism by Jackie Wang. Both are linked in the description. Thanks for watching. If you think I got anything wrong or would just like to add to the conversation, please leave a comment. If you like the video, go ahead and click like so YouTube's algorithm will share it with more people. You may subscribe to my channel if you feel inclined, but I don't have any current plans to make more videos. This is something I've wanted to share my thoughts on for a really long time and decided to make a channel just for this. I encourage you to share this video with your friends who don't think about politics much and aren't set on how they feel about this topic. Maybe share with conservatives you know and see how they feel. If you find yourself feeling lost on any other political issue of importance, the answer is probably to move left. So long.